On this edition of 1+1, how to win a Nobel Prize for Physics, the accountant who now sings for his supper, and lessons from an unexpected war zone. Matina Jewell was badly hurt while serving as a UN peacekeeper in southern Lebanon during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. As a result, she raised some uncomfortable observations about the safety of peacekeepers, as well as how injured veterans are treated by the Australian government. Detailed in her book, Caught in the Crossfire, she's been invited to New York to discuss her concerns with UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. Matina Jewell is now part of the federal government's Anzac Centenary Commission and an ambassador for the Australian Peacekeepers and Peacemakers Veterans Association. Matina Jewell, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for having me.
What made you want to become a UN peacekeeper?
Well, this was actually my 5th overseas mission with the Australian Defence Force, and it was a representation role working with the United Nations in the Middle East as a peacekeeper. And I thought this was a great step forward for my career because it would have that representational role experience with the UN. And also, I guess I was really driven by the opportunities to provide humanitarian aid to some of these very remote, disadvantaged communities in the Middle East. And that was really something that drew me to that particular role.
Were you surprised when you were supposed to be an observer of a truce in a way, but you ended up really in a war zone, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. We were there. Our mission was to observe and monitor a peace agreement between the countries of Israel, Lebanon and Syria. But suddenly, on the 12th of July, sort of out of the blue in 2006, the Hezbollah ambushed an Israeli Humvee patrol. During that attack, the Israelis actually suffered the loss of 4 soldiers were killed, and 2 of their soldiers were captured by the Hezbollah and taken back into Lebanon to, I guess the Hezbollah planned to use them as political bargaining chips for the release of their own Hezbollah prisoners in Israel. So this is what actually sparked the 2006 war, and suddenly it went from monitoring a peace agreement to being in the thick of a war zone.
So you were in Hezbollah territory?
Yes, where we were operating, I was actually part of Patrol Base Qiyam, which is a very small UN base which is situated right at the junction of the 3 countries, Israel, Lebanon and Syria. Patrol Base Qiyam itself was actually surrounded by 3 Hezbollah bases, and the closest to us was actually only 75 metres away. So if you think of a standard swimming pool as about 50 metres, 1.5 swimming pools away was a Hezbollah base that was also, I guess, monitoring our activities as a UN force as well.
Why do you think Israel bombed that base?
There had been a lot of fighting in that first week, and because of the Hezbollah activity around Patrol Base Qiyam, there was a lot of action in our region, and we'd had a number of near misses. And sadly, their repeated requests from the United Nations to Israel that they were actually endangering the lives of the UN peacekeepers on that base weren't adhered to in time. And unfortunately, on the evening of the 25th of July, an Israeli fighter jet delivered a 1,000-pound aerial bomb, and these are massive bombs that, they're laser guided, they're pinpoint accurate, and it was a direct hit on the bunker where my teammates were taking shelter. And these bombs can actually destroy, a good 5 or 10-storey building. They're very, very big weapon systems, and so the base was completely destroyed, instantly killing all of my teammates that were manning the base.
You were trained as a peacekeeper, I suppose, not to take sides, but do you think Israel hit that target on purpose?
I think, look, there's been 2 boards of inquiries that have been done, and there are still questions that remain unanswered. And I think until Israel can actually come and answer those questions, it'll be very difficult for people, the families of my teammates and the people that were serving with the UN to move forward with their lives. And so I'd be really keen to get more information on the situation myself. But I guess in my mindset, there's actually 3 organisations that I hold in varying degrees of responsibility for the deaths of my teammates. And that's, of course, Israel not taking enough care with one of these precision bombs and actually firing a direct hit on a bunker of a UN base with unarmed peacekeepers who had no way of defending themselves. The Hezbollah with their tactics where they actually move into civilian communities or fire from close to unarmed peacekeepers, which of course then draws the fire from Israel into these areas. And also the United Nations with their procedures that they weren't able to evacuate my teammates in time to avoid the deaths of my teammates. So.
When you were rotated out of the base, you were badly injured just before you managed to reach a city. The injuries then led you to be medically retired from the army. During that time, you spoke about a lot of failings, in a sense, of leadership around you. When you look back at that now, can you understand why those failings happened, or is that part of ordinary army life?
I think in relation to my injuries, and so I was injured just before I got to the UN headquarters in Tyr, and fractured 5 vertebrae in my back when I was thrown into the bulletproof windscreen of my armoured vehicle in this convoy that I was commanding. Unfortunately, the United Nations is a very different organisation to the Australian Defence Force. So in the ADF, we have a standard of what we call a golden hour rule, that anyone on the battlefield doesn't move on the battlefield unless they're within 1 hour of actually reaching a surgery-capable hospital. And unfortunately, the UN doesn't have this same sort of policy or procedure. So once I'd reached the UN headquarters and was seriously injured, I'd had numb, tingling sensations, I was immobilised, I was in a lot of pain, and unfortunately the UN evacuation processes had all failed. And as a result, I was then left on a tile floor for 2 days without any morphine while they scrambled to come up with an alternative plan, which eventually put me on a stretcher and on a boat to cross the Mediterranean Sea, a 20-hour boat ride to Cyprus to get to some medical aid. So I guess in terms of Australian standards, it was very much lower than what I would have expected in the ADF.
What effect do you think that ending the ban on women in combat is going to have on the Australian Defence Force?
I think it's a great step forward. I think there will definitely be women out there that do have the skill sets to work in these roles. I think it's imperative, though, that any women that want to work in these regions, there's new 7% of the jobs in the ADF that have just recently been announced as being open up to women, that they have the skills and also the physical attributes and also the intellectual capacity to actually work in those regions.
In reality, do you think there are going to be a lot of women who want to take up those roles?
I think there will definitely be some women. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of women. And also the same that some men don't have the skill sets to actually work in those regions. I think it will be a very select group of women that will have the skills to go into these new combat roles. But I don't expect there to be too much resistance, the same as has been experienced when the Defence Force first opened up to allow women to serve in the ADF, or when they first started training women to use and carry weapons on operations, when they first started women serving on Navy ships or on aircraft. And so I guess the Defence Force does have a great deal of experience in this change process.
There's been a lot of discussion at the moment about sexual misconduct in the military. When these allegations first started to emerge, did that actually smack of something that happened when you were being trained as a soldier, or did it come completely out of the blue?
I think, look, I can only talk about my experiences over a 15-year career. And look, I think as a woman in the ADF, it is a challenging environment. It's a tough environment. But for my own personal experiences, I hadn't ever perceived or seen any of that sort of degree of sort of harassment that we've seen in the media of late.
What about discrimination? Did you face discrimination?
I had a really fortunate career, and I guess from my experiences, I was actually able to do a number of roles that I didn't believe that I would have had the opportunity to do so.
How do you ensure that the life that you had and the ending of your career, and obviously there were some disappointments in how certain aspects of the bureaucracy were handled, how do you ensure that that doesn't become your future career, if you like, that you move forward from that?
I think you're right, there was a lot of disappointments, and having worked really hard for 15 years to establish my career and then to have it end suddenly through injuries on the battlefield, and having suffered so many things, having lost teammates who were like brothers to me, and dealing with the bureaucracy of the UN and the Australian government at times, I really did hit rock bottom after those, suffering those injuries and losing my career. And so there was, many years of a process of sort of rebuilding my life, and thankfully I just have the most amazing support network around me that has really helped me get back on my feet and move forward. But I'm now quite driven to ensure that there's some positive lessons learnt from those experiences and that other soldiers won't have to endure what I went through.
Matina Jewell, thank you very much for speaking with 1+1.
Thank you, Jane, for having me.